Hi, everybody. This is Britt Simon. So it's evening on, what is it? It's the 2nd of August. In California, it's fairly late at night, 10 to 9 or so, but my wife is until tomorrow, she's still in Europe. So I've got some time to talk to you. And because of a tweet by one of the lawyers, I feel like I need to jump on and talk about the DV2023 cap, the number of visas available. Okay. Now, in this session, I am doing this live rather than recording it, just because it's a bit easier for me, to be honest. I don't really want to take many questions. I try and hold your questions, please. I've got a few minutes of explanation to give about DV 2023, and I don't really want to talk about 24 or 2020 or 21. This is going to be about DV 2023 cap. Okay. So let me show you the tweet that I want to talk about for a start. Nicolette Glazer is a lawyer that has done some work, she says, in the DV space. She told me once she's been doing DV since 2011. I highly doubt that statement. It just doesn't make sense to me because I've never heard of her before a couple of years ago. And I've been doing this 10 years, so I don't think that's true. Anyway, she made this statement. She's obviously representing an adjustment to status case. Generally speaking, adjustment to status cases are better off not using lawyers, but in some cases, it's worthwhile using a lawyer. And there must be some case that that Nicolette Glazer has been dealing with. And she says, apparently the DV 2023 cap has been reached as of yesterday, according to local USCIS rep. But of course, DOS, Department of State, keeps on sending appointment interviews and collecting visa fees from people. How is that okay? Okay, so that's the statement that has been made. And I'm already, of course, getting inundated with questions about whether this is true, whether it can be true. Does this mean that DV 2023 is over? And so I feel like I need to address the misunderstandings in this tweet. It's clear she doesn't quite understand what's going on. And there's some sort of truth in there and there's sort of not, right? So, sometimes people say there's no smoke without fire. There is a little bit of a fire and there is some smoke, but it's not exactly what she's saying here. Firstly, USCIS are the organization that deal with cases in the United States, right? So as far as adjustment to status goes for DV lottery, that's handled through USCIS. And they have, when you're doing adjustment to status, you don't have a reserved visa for you. You go through the adjustment to status process, and during or just after the interview with the immigration officer, the immigration officer needs to check a system called IVAMS, IVAMS, and that system tells them whether there are any visas available or not. And the visas can be shut down by region or for a country or for the whole world globally, right? And so Nicolette Glazer hasn't stated which country of chargeability her case is regarding. Sorry about my dog; she's a bit nervous for some reason. So she hasn't mentioned which country or which region or anything. So we could either take that at face value as being a statement about all of the whole global quota, or it could be something related to a specific country that has reached the 7% cap, or a region that has reached a cap, because despite what some of the lawyers and Miles Morgan think, there is a regional quota that's applied to this program, and in fact this year has proven that categorically, although I already had many examples from previous years where I've known that to be the case. Okay, so what is this all about? Is this remotely true? There is a conversation between her and Curtis below here. Curtis saying it doesn't sound right. Nicolette saying it's right. And, going back and forth. They're just confusing each other. Really, I wish in a way I could reach out and set them straight. But I don't know. They're confusing each other. It made me think of a movie earlier, but anyway, don't need to worry about that movie at the moment. Let me explain what is actually the position at the moment, and hopefully Poppy, my dog, will cooperate and let me talk. Poppy, any chance of shutting up? Okay, let me see if I can explain. So I'm going to pull this spreadsheet across here and talk about the numbers that we know about. So I'll talk about what we know, and then I'll talk about what we don't know will happen or is happening, etc. And you'll be able to understand what I'm getting at here. First of all, let me make this much bigger. That's way too small. Okay, so this should be easier to read. Okay, so we always can refer to the SEAC data. Now, Zarthisius published his data as of Friday night, and on Friday night, we had about 45,000 visas issued. I've checked the data in another file today, which is scraped on a daily basis, and we actually have 46,000 visas issued to date, right? 46,000. Now that's a solid number. We're not incorrect about that. The SEAC data that we get and our method for scraping it, etc., is accurate. And we've proven in the past it's been as accurate, in fact, even more accurate than the government's own understanding of their own numbers. So this is a solid number, 46,000, right? Now, I've also listed out some other numbers that are in play here. One of the things that we can assume is that adjustment to status cases, which take about 1,500 cases a year, by the way, 1,500 visas a year. It's usually between 1,000 and 1,500, and it's in that range, right? And the lawyers were discussing that, trying to understand that, but there clearly isn't 10,000 cases in DV 2023. There's just not. I mean, there isn't, right? So, but I think it's safe to assume that around about 1,000 visas have been taken through adjustment to status already in this year, including quite a number of cases that have been issued without even an interview, because that is possible in adjustment to status. But so let's call that 1,000. Let's call that a solid number as well, just as an assumption, although it is a bit of a guess. It's not in SEAC data. We can't confirm that number until the end of the year. But last year in DV 2022, that number was about 1,500. And in previous years, the lowest number I've seen for a year, I think, was about 800 in a normal year I'm talking about, not DV 2020 or 21. So in a typical normal year, it'd be about 1,000 as a minimum. So I'm just going to assume 1,000. So we've got 47,000 visas are accounted for without a doubt, right? If we look at Zarthisius's data, he's got a number out there as of Friday of about 19,000 people, approximately, who are in ready status. That's people who have received their 2NL and they're scheduled for an interview. However, there are about 7,000 of those 19,000 that were scheduled for interview prior to August, right? So in June, July, May, April, March, etc., going right back to the beginning of the year. Now, once a case hasn't turned up for their interview in a given month, their case is considered a no-show by us and also by the government, and their visa can be recycled, right? The visa that was allocated to that case, or visas, if it was with derivatives, can be recycled, reused, if you like, for other cases. And so those 7,000 of the 19,000 that are currently on ready will have been recycled by now, okay? Because they were from previous months. So there aren't really going to be any of these 7,000 coming across into the final column, right? We call this the final column. This is current. And so none of those are going to come across. Now, I hesitate to say none, because we could have some cases that were interviewed, let's say at the end of July, and they still show ready, but actually there's something going on. Maybe they're going to be issued, maybe they're going to turn to AP 221G or whatever, right? So they could be a few of those, but it would be a few hundred, at the very most, from all of the months before. And so I'm not even going to take any of those. I'm just going to ignore those, right? Then scheduled in August, that and the remainder of August, bearing in mind that we've already had 2 days, right? There's about 6,500 people scheduled in August. And there's about 5,400 people scheduled in September. Actually, prior to, a few weeks ago, I was talking about, what I thought would happen in terms of how the scheduling would go for September. My assumption was that they would send out about 1,000, up to about 1,000 2NLs for September, because that to me looked like the most they could send within the cap without causing themselves problem and allowing for cases which are in 221G, right? They actually have sent 2,600 2NLs. As this was happening, as they were sort of kept on sending 2NLs, I was like watching this thinking, what the hell are they doing? They're going too far. They're issuing too many 2NLs. They are overscheduling. And that has been my position for at least a couple of weeks, that they've overscheduled, right? And we've got a pretty good handle on how these things work out. Whether people will receive their visas after after the interview or not. We know roughly the Poppy. We know roughly the amount of people that get refused, that don't show up for their interview, that get put onto 221G and so on. We can calculate those. But even taking into consideration the calculations there are about 11,900, just about 12,000 people that have been scheduled. And you can clearly see there are not enough visas for 12,000 people to be issued. That would take us way too close to 60,000, right? So how many of the visas will be issued from these two groups that are scheduled for August and scheduled for September? And then what do they do about 221G? Because there are about 5,000 people still in 221G trying to get cleared, hoping to be cleared by the embassy, etc., and have their visas issued also. And so we need to sort of ignore this number. I'm just going to put 0 in there. But between these three blocks or types of cases, where are the visas going to go, right? Now, let's just assume that between no-shows and refusals, both temporary and 221G, we take about 20% off of the number of people scheduled. So 6,500 will lose about 1,300 people or so, and we could see 5,000 issued from the 6,500 that are scheduled in August, right? So let's just sort of play some games and say, okay, let's say if we put 5,000 in from that. Let's say also that for 221G, let's say they clear, let's say 2,000 of those, right? That puts us at 54,000, right? Now, that's one possible way to look at things before we get into September. It would only leave about 1,000 visas before the cap, right? And 1,000 visas for what will then be the remainder of the 221G cases, which will be about 3,000, perhaps 4,000, because some more will have been added. And the cases scheduled in September, right? So that's one possible way to look at it. The other possible way to look at it would be that they say, okay, we're not going to issue any 221G visas. We're going to let the cases scheduled in September, we're going to treat those as if the visa is reserved, because that is always what we've understood to be the way they allocate cases. Now, if we lose 20%, of this number, we should have what, about 43, let's say 4,300 of those. Is that right? Yeah, about 4,300 of those should go through. That would break our cap, right? So even if they don't give any 221G visas out, that's going to exceed the cap. So let's talk about the cap, because we can do this math any way we want, but we can certainly see that we've got a problem with the cap of 55,000. Now, up until DV2022, no year had come close to hitting the cap. And it was always my understanding that the cap was a hard cap. The law is written very clearly. It's 55,000. If you're going to tell us that the September 30th fiscal year is a hard and fast rule because it's in the law, then also in the law is the 55,000, right? So, you know, it's very difficult to say that one thing is absolute law and very important, and we can't go past the 30th of September, and the next minute you just ignore the law and you say, yeah, we can go past 55,000. So up until DV 2022, I had always believed strongly that they would not exceed the cap. Then in DV 2022, they exceeded the cap by about nearly 1,000 cases, 1,000 visas. To me, that appeared to be a lack of organization. It looked like a mistake. I don't think it was deliberate. It's just that in July, August, and September, they were throwing so many cases at things. They were doing the best they could to try and schedule cases, and they got out of control a little bit, it seemed to me, right? And therefore exceeded the cap by accident, in my opinion. The cap, when they hit the number, which was 55,900 or something, we got this confirmed later. And of that number, about 1,500 of those were adjustment of status cases. And so, you know, we knew that they had hit the cap, like on 30th September, we already knew that they'd hit or exceeded the cap, because we didn't know the adjustment of status cases number yet, but we knew pretty solidly that it was at least 1,000. So we knew that they had broken the cap, right? We knew that. So they did exceed the cap in DV 2022. So in the last couple of weeks, some of us that have been talking about these things, some of the people that know, which is USCIS, who's taking a very keen interest in this and obviously puts out all the data, and a couple of guys, Marek and Klefs, who do an amazing job in one of the Telegram channels, or a couple of the Telegram channels, in answering questions, etc. We've been having a good-natured, friendly debate about whether the cap will be enforced or not. And none of us really know. We don't know for a fact what will happen, right? So we've just been debating back and forth. The numbers seem to suggest that if you ignored the cap completely, and if you took over, let's say, 3,500 of the 5,000, right, you would have about 60,000. So at the top end, we say, okay, that would take 60,000 visas. I think that's way too much. I don't believe the government are going to issue 60,000 visas. That's a complete disregard of the law. Seems nuts to me. I just don't believe that's going to happen. Now, could they exceed the cap by 1,000 or 2,000, perhaps? I don't know. They did it last year. Who's to say they won't again this year? Or will they be tough on the cap and enforce that as an absolute rule this year? If they do that, then we've certainly got a problem, because I don't see any way out of the bit of the mess they've created. They created this mess with the best intention, but frankly, with a lack of control. They seem to, I mean, the frustrating thing was, I had said earlier in the year, over the last 2 or 3 months, I've been pointing out that they've actually been putting themselves into a brilliant position where they could pretty much reach the cap and control things so that all of the work was done by the end of August, and that they didn't really need to schedule very many interviews at all for September. They could just use September to tidy up the 221G cases, which is a fair thing, because those 221G cases, remember, every one of those cases, they've already sat the interview, they've paid their fees, they've paid for their medical, and they are as deserving as anyone else, right? And so if you're waiting for your 2NL, you'll say, no, give me my 2NL, of course. But these other people in 221G, they have paid their money. They have been through their interview process, and their cases were ahead of yours in whatever priority scheme is in operation, which we know. But we know what the priorities, how the priorities are set. But nevertheless, they were there first, right? Whether you agree with the way that the prioritization of cases, how that operates or not, doesn't really matter. The point is they were in there first. They had their interview, and now they've been waiting for maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months for their cases to be processed by KCC and the government. And so they are, in my mind, they are more entitled than new cases, to expect their visa should be available. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. The 221G cases tend to get the leftovers, right? So I think the priority will go more like this. I think what will happen is, let me take these out for a second. I think they'll do all of the August cases that they've scheduled, right? And I think they'll probably, I've got a feeling they're going to issue probably 1,000, maybe 2,000 of the 221G cases during August. So we'll be at around about 53,000, right? This could easily be 2,000. They could, in a normal year, they often clear, in August and September, they clear that number of 221Gs. So if they operate in a normal way, they could go through this process and say, okay, we'll clear the 221Gs that we've got, and we'll do all of the interviews for August. And then that would leave us with a position where they either exceed the cap or they start cancelling interviews for September, okay? Which is brutal news if that's true. But we don't really know if it's true or not. This part of this video is complete speculation. We don't know. This is stuff we don't know. The numbers we know, the law we know. How they're actually going to implement the law and what they're going to do next, we can only speculate about. None of us know, right? I just want to make this very clear. I don't know what they're going to do next, nor does Marek or Klefs or Zarthisius, and certainly none of the lawyers having this crazy discussion today. Nobody really is in control of that information. We don't know how they're going to operate, right? Now, I can see, by the way, that from a USCIS perspective, Department of State have kind of the control about how many visas they release into the IVAMS system. And so it is possible that KCC could have pulled the plug on the IVAM system, leading to the comment that was made to Nicolette Glazer, right? So, it could be possible that there are no more visas for adjustment of status. I don't know that one way or the other, and there's probably another 200 or 300 people that are expecting to get their adjustment of status cases through in the next 2 months. But I just don't know whether those are going to be issuable or not. It is possible, as I mentioned earlier, that the case that she's dealing with could be capped for a different reason. Perhaps it's from Algeria, and Algeria, we know, is very, very close to the 7% cap, which is a cap on every country, right? And so it's a limit. It's a cap that can't be exceeded. It's not a quota, just so we're clear about that. So it's possible that that's the case for Nicolette Glazer, but I don't know. It's possible that that it's a regional cap being applied to that particular case, or, as I say, it could be that KCC have basically not funded the bank in terms of IVAMs and said, no, we're not going to put any more cases into your bank. Now, if I were Nicolette Glazer, by the way, I would be arguing this, because there is no technical way that that the cap can be fully exhausted before the end of August. So if she's got a case that is entitled to an interview now in adjustment of status, she should be, if she's a lawyer, she should be working to say, hang on a minute, I know for a fact you have not exhausted all the visas, and my guy is entitled to an interview for his adjudication now, And if you've got a visa, you should issue it to him, right? Rather than issuing that to a 221G or to some of these cases you scheduled for September. Now, that's how I would play it if I were her, but I'm not a lawyer. And she doesn't have the information. So unless she's watching this video or gets educated by someone else, she's not going to know to have that argument or how vehemently to have that argument, which is a shame for her client, but that's the way it is. That's the situation with the numbers, right? Now, what do I think is going to happen? I really don't want to make a bet on what I think is going to happen. I don't think any of us know enough to be sure about how this is going to go. The only thing that I feel confident in saying is that I think if you're scheduled for an interview in August, you're pretty safe, right? 99.9% safe. I've noticed that there's at least one embassy which was just given a handful of interviews. This is Auckland Embassy. And they were given some interviews for September, which I'd been waiting to see because Oceania as a region got an additional bump in the last visa bulletin, as we know. There are people there that got scheduled on dates from the 1st of September to the 24th of September, I think, and probably several dates in between. And just today, those people are starting to report that the embassy has pulled their interviews into August, accelerated the interviews, which I'd actually suggested to that group of people that they should be accelerating their interviews if they could. And that could be the make or break for those cases, right? And in the same way, if you're scheduled for a September interview and you're listening to my channel because you're smart, then I would, if I were you, I would ask your embassy, I'd reach out to the embassy and say, is there any way I can get an earlier interview date? Can you see me earlier? Because I think one way or the other, we either hit a brick wall in September or KCC stand by the scheduled appointments that they've made and say, yeah, we're going to honor all those and we're going to exceed the cap. But I don't know whether they're able to do that and whether they will or won't do that, right? But you can clearly see the problem from the numbers that we've got going on out there. Who do you give, if this is the scenario, ignoring 221G and ignoring the cases in September, how do you prioritize between these groups of people? Then, at what point do you say enough is enough? Do you exceed the cap by 1,000 because last year they did 1,000 too many? Do you say no, the cap is absolutely rigid? And as I've mentioned earlier, in all of the years that I know of, we've never been within this striking distance of the cap, apart from DV2023. If they had a cap of, let's say, 50,000, you'd see them issue up to about 48,000 and then stop. And the way they would stop was by controlling the visa bulletin. But the visa bulletin was allowed to go too far this year, and it created a situation where they've scheduled a hell of a lot of people, over 75,000 people now. So they created this scenario unwisely, you could say, or not unwisely. I mean, it benefits us, but of course, there is an aspect of if they can ignore the law in our benefit, they can ignore the law against our benefit as well. So you kind of want them to be lawful. If you've got a choice about things, you want to be able to hold them to the law, and you expect them to hold themselves to that standard too. But I'm not suggesting that I wouldn't love to see the cap being exceeded, right? I would love to see that, but I'd be a bit worried about it too. Okay, so that's the scenario that we've got. Like I say, I think you're safe if you're scheduled in August. If you're scheduled in September, you would be my next sort of least risky group. And then I really don't know what they're going to do about 221G, but understand every case they issue for 221G cases in August is going to be taken out of the mouth of the cases in September, unless the cap is wildly exceeded, which I really don't think is going to be the case. I don't think they're going to 60,000. I'm not in Marek's camp 60,000. I'm not ready to go there. So that's really where we're at in terms of the numbers. Yeah, so let's I'm going to take a few questions related to this topic. I don't want to take any other questions. So I'm just going to keep it on this topic. So that's really what I just talked about. Who's most favorites to get visas between 221G and those ready for interview? So that's the thing. It's a toss-up. It's a zero-sum game in a sense if the cap is held firm. How many cases can they clear of 221G in August? They could easily clear 2,000, but will they? Or will they say, look, what I've seen in the past is where they've said, the embassy has said, we've finished your period of what they call administrative processing, or 221G. We've finished that, but we're requesting visas from KCC, and then KCC are in charge of assigning those visas to the embassy. And so KCC can actually juggle these balls. They can actually control the number. And they should do. That's part of their job. That's what they're supposed to do. Question here. I didn't receive my 2NL. My embassy is Pakistan. My case number is under 20,000. Is there any hope for me? All of the questions, regardless of whether it's Pakistan or Abu Dhabi or any other embassy, if you haven't received your 2NL by now, and you're looking and paying attention with what I'm explaining, then you must understand that you're extremely at risk. You're extremely unlikely to get a 2NL at this point. I don't know whether we might see a few 2NLs in the next few days, just a handful for a few embassies or something, but they really shouldn't be issuing any more 2NLs. They should have stopped actually, quite some time ago. And the only one that I was convinced I would see was Auckland, because it was conspicuously missing from the batches of interviews that we had seen scheduled. That was the only one. That was kind of like the one that just came out the other day in Auckland. So that was the one that to me was kind of the nail in the coffin. But I'm not saying that it's impossible for us to see some more 2NLs, 10, 5 2NLs or whatever tomorrow and the next day. I mean, that's possible. But are we going to see some embassy taking 200 interviews? No, complete bullshit. That's not going to happen. Right? And so, yeah, if you don't have your 2NL now, then you're probably not going to get in. And even if you did get a 2NL now, that would be for a September interview. And you can see the problem, right? September interviews are already at risk. Okay, so no one can answer about the cutoff Asia region. I've explained that many times. So I don't know why you're saying nobody can answer. I've explained how regional quotas work. Asia is above. They're going to exceed their quota, right? So that's that. And if you're asking, will the 21,000 number be increased? No, it absolutely won't be increased. The visa bulletin numbers that we've already seen the other day are the final numbers for the year. That's it. It's done. It's over. It's not going to go above 21,000 in Asia or any other changes in any other region. You've got to start accepting the realities. And even if some other talking head or YouTuber or lawyer or whatever is filling your heads full of nonsense, doesn't matter what they're saying. You just have to look at what's realistic and true. Okay. Oh, and you're saying it's unfair to DV winners from Asia. No, it's not. It's not unfair to DV winners from Asia. Asia has benefited from the underfilling of visas from Africa. Africa has been underfilled again. And if you want to find victims in this year's lottery in terms of who's been treated unfairly, you'll find them mainly in Africa. You won't find them in Asia. Because there are no embassies in Asia that have misbehaved in the same way that there are several embassies in Africa that have misbehaved, and because Africa has underfilled, part of their quota has been taken from Africa and distributed to the other regions. So please, let's not pretend that Asia has been, disrespected or, or what do you say, treated unfairly. That's not true. And if you don't understand the quotas that I've explained in the past, then, I'm sorry, it's unfortunate. But the reality is that between Asia and South America, those two regions combined are supposed to get no more than 20% of the available visas. In other words, 11,000 of the 55,000. That's the law. That's how the process is designed. That's the quota system, the regional quota system at play. That's how it's supposed to work. So in years like last year and years like this year, where that number 11,000 is being exceeded, or close to being exceeded, that's a benefit to them, not and it's only because the other regions are giving some quota to them. So let me see. Why stop Asia at 21,000? Well, because there's a quota, and there were too many selectees. Again, I've been explaining this for a year. By now, we should really all understand that there was an over selection. If you select 119,000 people for 55,000 visas, there are too many people, right? And that means that someone's going to miss out. And so Africa went all the way to its limit because some embassies in Africa misbehaved and destroyed the chances for large numbers of people in certain embassies. Whilst that wasn't the case in Asia, and was only partially the case in Europe, not disadvantaged to the same extent that Africa was disadvantaged. And then South America and Oceania have been pretty normal. What about Colombo? This one I knew was going to come up. Marek's been sort of champion for Colombo Embassy. A few days ago, Marek was listing Accra, Colombo, and Auckland as the three embassies that he was hoping to see or expecting to see get some of the last two NLs. Accra seemed to have increased their number from 25 to 50 for August, essentially, and took nothing for September. But Accra have just done a bloody horrible job this year. And then Colombo, for whatever reason, Colombo haven't taken any. They could take a few more in September, but as I say, there's going to be a problem if they do. The problem being that there aren't going to be very many visas left, and KCC could be sort of shutting that down at the moment anyway. They could be shutting down all scheduling. We already have seen, by the way, some embassies responding to people that their particular embassy and KCC between them are saying there's no more interviews that are going to be set up. Now, that could be a specific response from the embassy, or it could be something passed down from KCC. We don't really know. So we are very close to the end of interviews. There's no doubt about that, and you can see the numbers why. Poppy's grumpy about that. No, shush. Okay, so let me just see if there's any more questions on this particular point. Bradley, you're from Auckland. Was not able to make the August date they gave me. Oh, God. They said we just offered a bit earlier appointment in case some of you need to get additional documents. Hopefully true. Right, Bradley, and anyone else at Auckland that has been offered to take the August date. Literally, your choice is going to come down to, if you decide to slip yourself back into September, you're putting at risk your case. I hope that's getting across to you. You're gambling with your case. So if you have been offered an earlier date, I don't care what you've got to cancel in order to get there, or whether you can't get your documents together in time, or whatever reason, you get your ass there, okay? And get to that interview. And if necessary, follow up a couple of days later with whatever document you need to provide, but don't let the whole process go into September. You're significantly putting yourself at risk if you do that. And you can see why. You can see the numbers, right? So yeah, Bradley, please Don't mess that up. You're so close. Don't mess it up. Don't snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Why they select too many people for DV while there's only 55k visas available? They do. They have done for years. They over-select because not everyone proceeds. They don't know exactly how many to over-select, and in particular, Africa is consistently underfilling because the number of derivatives on a typical African case is a lot lower. Let me just show you this, because one of the lawyers gets this wrong all the time as well. But let me show you this. Because of the number of derivatives per case, the derivative rate in Africa has actually had the most the most cases scheduled, right? And 15,383 cases scheduled and 220 in transit. So 15,500, nearly 15,600 cases have been scheduled, right? But their number is significantly lower of issued, is significantly lower than EU, right? Even though EU have only 11,600, nearly 11,700 cases, right? There's a higher derivative rate in EU. So that means that they've got to schedule a lot more cases in Africa to yield the same number of cases. Then the refusal rates in Africa tend to be a bit higher because people are not quite so wealthy, let's say. The education system's perhaps not quite as developed as in the EU in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases. And there's typically a little bit more no-show activity in Africa, which I suspect is to do with the economics of the sheer expense of going through this process. For some African selectees is just too much of a burden. So they submit their DS260 and they're scheduled, but they don't show up for their interview. So there's quite a lot of no-show activity in Africa. But don't forget also that certain embassies in Africa, like Nairobi, like Accra, and so on, have decimated the chances of thousands of people in Africa region. And of the 50,000 people selected in Africa, roughly, probably 10,000 had their chances just blown out the water because of the bad behavior of some embassies in Africa. It's at least 10,000, which is horrific, but that's the way it is, right? So hope that's clear. Okay. There's a 24 question there. Look, I didn't want to answer 24 questions, but just understand, well, firstly, you say my case number is 20,554. Without giving me a region, your number is completely pointless. It's completely meaningless. You have to say it's Asia or it's Europe or it's Africa. But let me just say about the numbers. We will know in about 2 weeks' time what the selectee numbers are. That information will almost certainly be published on the next visa bulletin. We'll have a breakdown by country of how many selectees there are per country, and we add that up and we can see how many selectees there are. That's an important piece of data that we know, because you can't say whether your case number is too high or not without knowing whether we're over-selected or not, right? So you could have a very high case number, but there could be a lot more holes in this year's data than we've seen in previous years. And therefore, you could have a 60,000, Africa 60,000 number, or an Africa 100,000 number, let's say, right? Which is equivalent to maybe a 50,000 number in DV2023. And Africa went current to 63,502, right? So you can't say that your case number is high, or anything really, until we know a little bit more about the data. So you don't know yet, right? So I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, so DV2020 and DV2021, I've got no information about that. We're still waiting for the appeals. There's just, and there is no way to force the appeal judges to make a decision, and so on and so forth, right? There's just no information. So no point asking me about that question tonight. Let me just see. The dog is upset with lawyers. Yeah, I mentioned lawyers, and she goes, yeah. All right, let me just see if there's a page from Australia. Yeah, you're Sydney. I should imagine you're probably an August interview. But again, if you're if you're in a situation where you've got a September interview, any of you in any embassy, contact your embassy and see if they'll do that earlier, right? There's approximately 5,000 people booked in for September interviews. I'm shocked that they went that far, frankly. They should really only have, if they'd have sort of done what I expected, they're not listening to me, obviously, but if they'd have done what I expected, we would only see about 2,000 people. And because we only see about 2,000 people scheduled, then this number would be a lot less stressed, and there would be some room for 221Gs and everything. We'd be happy all ways around. But they just kept on sending 2NLs, and I'm like, in one way I was pleased, and in another way I was horrified, because they've clearly created a last-minute disaster from what was up to then a very well-run year, with the exception of some stupid embassies, right? Okay. Just see if I've got any other questions. This is kind of a weird time for me to be online, so it's great for those down under, but it's not so great for anyone else in Europe or Africa. So there you go. All right. So, do you think we could have more 2NLs for Nairobi DV2023 before the end? Nairobi took 134 interviews on, I think, the 14th, which was a good number for Nairobi. Nairobi has done a shitty job this year, terrible, and they're an embassy that's responsible for taking not only their own local selectees, but also the selectees from other countries. And so they are one of the worst embassies in my mind. But they did take 134 interviews scheduled, to be scheduled on the 14th. But they're not going to take any more, partly because of what I'm explaining tonight, and partly because why would they go back and give more interviews to embassies that have already taken a bunch of interviews for September, when they haven't yet given interviews to embassies like Accra or Colombo, that have had no interviews set up for September? Why would they go round and give some people second helpings, right, when some other embassies have had no first helpings, right? So it doesn't make any sense. So I'm sorry to be brutal, but you have to understand, in Nairobi and other similar situations, you're not going to get any more 2NLs, and we've got a problem here. We're running out of visas, so so it wouldn't help you to get a 2NL at this point. Okay. Some cases are waiting in 2023. Look, in DV 2022, we knew that there were 119,000 people selected in DV 2022. We know that the government stated that they had processed at least 103,000 DS260s, and they scheduled about 70,000 people. So there were 30,000 people that had their DS260 processed but never got an interview. All right. This year will be similar. There will be about 30,000 people that have been told your DS260 is processed, or you're current for interview processing, and similar sort of statements from KCC, but it won't mean a damn thing. You're not going to get your interview. The vast majority of those people are not going to get the interview, and even some of the people who've got their interview already, I think, are at risk. Okay, so yeah, that's that's how it works, unfortunately. Okay, so don't know if you answered this already. I was put on 221G on the 13th because of a document which I didn't have the original copy. Oh God, that's something I need to talk about. Is there a chance for me? Well, if you were put on 221G because of a missing document, you need to run out of the embassy, jump in a taxi, and go and get that freaking document that you didn't take to the interview. And then kick yourself in the backside for not preparing like I tell people to prepare for interviews. And so the wake up call to people who've got an interview in August and September, bloody well make sure you are properly prepared for that interview. This is a chance of a lifetime. Do not miss a document. Take more documents than is required, right? Take additional documentation. Think about your case. This this could be your only chance. And if you get yourself into 221G, what happens is you could have a reserved visa for you in the month of August, let's say. You go on 221G in August, and at the end of August, the visa that's allocated to your case will be taken away and it will be given to someone else. That's how it works. So to you, Unku, is it? Unku chaps, get your arse in here and get that sorted out. That was the 13th. Oh man, that was the 13th of last month. So unfortunately, you now, if you're still on 221G right now, you've just lost your visa. They've reallocated that into the pool. If you hurry up, you might be able to get that reallocated. But you're in this bucket of people now. You're in that 221G bucket of people now because you didn't have a document with you on the 13th. So please, I don't want to hear any more stories like that. I mean, it just makes. I'm sorry to get worked up at it, and I don't mean to belittle you or criticize you. I just want to shake some of you sometimes and say, wake up, wake the freak up, right? This is not something you mess around with. I provide plenty of information. The instructions are complete. There's no excuse to turn up for the interview without documents. My case status is interview processing, not yet received, yet CNL, Fact Inside. You've been attending my videos for so long, Fact Inside, haven't you? It's horrible. You've got a low case number. I don't know what to say, really. It's just this time of year. I gave some of my colleagues in the DV space, I just gave them a link today on dealing with grief. This time of year, there's going to be people going through grief, and there are 7 or 5 stages of grief. Anger and what is it? Anger and denial and negotiation and so on, and eventually there's acceptance. But I expect a certain amount of lashing out. I always get every year. There's someone who blames me for something. I don't know. I've been blamed for pretty much everything in my 10 years doing this. But and I've warned Marek and Clefs and Zarthisius, you will be blamed. It's just human nature that people get angry. They're in grief. They have lost something. It's like losing a loved one. And it's a very human, normal reaction to just look for someone to blame. And to lash out, and so it's understandable. I don't blame anybody that goes through those stages of grief. That's just a natural human being thing. But it just shouldn't be like that. So is there any opportunities to receive it? Probably not, but Colombo is one of those embassies which it wouldn't shock me totally to see a few more 2NLs. But the risk here is that you'll get a 2NL, which will be for September, and you could find that gets cancelled. And it would be only right for them to cancel interviews and not take fees from people, and not encourage people to get medical interviews and that sort of thing. It would only be right to let people know in advance. They should not let you come to an interview and then tell you at the interview, after you've paid the fees and you've paid for the medical, they shouldn't sort of get you in there and say, oh my, there's no visa for you. They shouldn't do that, right? Yeah, so I think that's probably as much as I can say. I hope delete your CN. Always it kind of makes me chuckle a little bit about these people. Look, I've got a file here. Let me just show you. I got a file. I got every case number there is. Just because I've got a case number, just because someone tells me that their case number is SA3089 doesn't mean diddly. It's not a risk to give me that number or to publish that number in public. It's only a risk if you give that number to someone that knows you, knows your full name and perhaps your date of birth and perhaps your email address and has information about you. To give your number to strangers is actually less of a worry than giving your number to people that you know. So keep your personal information personal, keep it private, but don't worry if you've put your case number in this chat or whatever. It's not really a problem. Okay. All right. So I'll just check lastly. Yeah, no other questions on this particular topic. I hope this was helpful. I hope it's probably not great news for some of you, and it's probably worrying. And I don't mean to add to your stress and your worry, but I do feel like everybody going through this process should be an adult. And as adults, I expect you to be able to take the information and process it in whatever way you feel you want to process it. And if you want to lash out at someone and be angry at someone, you're welcome to be angry at me. I've got thick skin, or the government or anything else. But it is what it is, and we can't really fault the government for the job they've done this year centrally, KCC, right? We can fault a number of embassies who have behaved badly, but KCC actually, in the last 2 years, have really upped their game. They still don't know what they're doing. They still, their directors don't even understand the rules of the game, frankly. But nevertheless, from a work effort point of view and from a well-meaning, intentioned way of working, they've done the best they can do. And it's not an easy thing. It's quite a complicated thing that they're doing. We sometimes lash out and we make fun of them, etc. But the reality is it's quite a difficult job, I'm sure, and it's a difficult thing to organize. Interviews at 180 embassies around the world and all the different languages involved and all the different emotions and everything else. I should imagine it's a very difficult job. Oh, this is what you didn't have. Scan copy of the document. Please clearance document from my country of Oregon, but I'm based in UAE. So you didn't have a police document, a police certificate. And the officer refused to collect it. Why would he collect it? Maybe that's the process in your particular country. I don't know, but nevertheless, if you go to an interview, you need to take the documents. Most of the COs are looking to approve cases. Let me tell you that. They don't want to make your life difficult. They don't want to say no. These are fun cases for COs. That when they see people who've won the lottery, they're normally interviewing people on family-based cases, employment-based cases, and all these other things where there's a complex process and they sometimes have to say no and all this sort of stuff, right? The DV lottery, as someone walks in from the DV lottery, their mood is lifted normally. 99% of the time, the CO is in a happy mood because they're looking at someone across the desk who has just won a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and they're very aware of that, and they don't want to make that a challenge for that person. So all you got to do is read the instructions, gather all the documents that you're supposed to take, and then think about what other documents you could take, and make sure you've got everything you possibly can, so that if they ask you a question or if they're unsure about something, oh, you want to see my education certificates? No problem. Here you go. Oh, you want to see my CV about my work history? No problem. Here you go. Right? You want to know how much money I've got in the bank account? Yeah, here's my bank account. But I've also got this I-134 from a friend in in America who's going to help me. These documents are not necessarily listed as required documents, but if you're not a bloody fool, you should get all these documents together and take them to the interview, right? Police certificates, that's listed, so that one kind of frustrates me more than most. But anyway, I'm sure there was some reason for it. Well, no, I'm getting a few more questions here, but let's see. Shakazod, well, please answer the question about, I don't know what your question is, and I don't want to scroll up to look for it. So very, very quickly put that in the chat again. What will happen if 221G happens? Because the medical ready from the hospital side. Because the medical, okay. So if you have to go to an interview and your medical is not ready, then typically you can get that to the embassy within a few days after the interview, and typically that would just release your case. Your case will then be approved. There are a few countries, particularly where there's an organization called IOM, who tend to restrict people from attending the interviews if they don't have the medical. That actually shouldn't be allowed. But this IOM organization seems to have that sort of power in some countries. But generally speaking, you can attend your interview even without the medical and then follow up with the medical. I wouldn't normally suggest it, but it is technically possible. It should be possible with most embassies. And then you just follow up later. Okay. Yeah, KCC reply me that your case is interview processing. What they say is your case is current for interview processing. That is the precise wording. That is AV status. Email number 4, if you've been in some of the chat channels. And it means nothing because it means you haven't been scheduled. And depending on when you entered the queue of people at AV status, you could be quite low priority in that queue. And unfortunately, it doesn't mean anything. The only thing that means something is actually getting the 2NL. And in previous years, as I say, up until this year, I've always told people if you've got a 2NL, it means there's a visa reserved for you. But KCC have broken that math, if you want to put it like that. They've made it so that they've issued so many 2NLs that there's no reasonable explanation for them to have done that and stay under the 55,000 cap. So I think they've messed something up. I think they've broken an important part of the visa number control system, and they've made a bit of a mess. With the best will in the world, with the best intentions, but they've made a mess. Okay, is why an embassy in Jakarta is working wildly. They're giving various reasons not to schedule an interview. Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about Jakarta specifically, so I can't answer you that. But I'm showing you that there is significant problem throughout the world with scheduling. Based on the fact that we're almost out of visas, right? So I don't know how Jakarta have behaved throughout the year, but there are some embassies that have done absolutely no interviews, despite the fact that there are people waiting for interviews. Nigeria is one case, Nami is another. Again, mainly in Africa. But some embassies have just refused to do any work, or they've done so little work with, like Accra, with their 25 and 30 a month, that they have built up a huge backlog of cases, which they couldn't possibly resolve. And so it's been obvious for some months, and I've been talking about it. I haven't hidden this from you, but it's been obvious for some months that at some embassies there was going to be a very sad end, and some people perhaps hadn't heard my words on that, but that's the reality. That's what's going to happen. Can you sue the embassy in Accra? No, you can't. There have been lawsuits to try and change the behavior of embassies. And in general, the government have always come back and said, whilst we can set policy centrally, we cannot tell the embassies what to do. They're entitled to set their own rules about their own capacity. And so Accra have set the capacity level for DV cases at such a low level that they've created this problem. But they are entitled to do that. And frankly, once the damage is done, the damage is done, right? It doesn't make sense to sue them after the end of the year to try and get some sort of revenge on them or something, because there's no remedy that can be given to you, right? They can't say, oh yeah, you're right, you filed a lawsuit, you told us of, and here's a visa. They can't do that. So I suggest you don't even try, frankly. It hasn't worked. There was a case Jesse Bless filed that I strongly believe did have an effect on an embassy. It was Sydney Embassy. It had an effect in terms of modifying the behavior of another embassy. Suva Embassy actually stood up and helped the disaster that Sydney was creating in DV 2020. Was that 2022 or 21? I can't remember. But yeah, Suva Embassy stood up and helped, and that was awesome. And that was basically because they got word of how Sydney was creating a mess, because Sydney had moved embassy locations and stuff. So, this is a good question, actually. What are some of the best performing embassies in Africa? This year, Algeria and Morocco have done an amazing job. Algeria has done so well that it's in danger of hitting the cap, 7% cap. There's a rule in DV lottery and all immigration, actually, that no one country can benefit from more than 7% of the overall global quota, which is 3850 visas. Well, Algeria had 5,600 selectees, and even though they didn't go current, there were enough selectees current, and Algeria did such a good job scheduling and issuing them that Algeria have probably hit the 7% cap, or they've got very, very close to it. So Algeria has probably been the best embassy. Cairo is also normally a very good embassy. They've got a very high approval rate, but didn't do a good job this year, nor last year. So they are on my shit list. But yeah, Algeria and Morocco have been the best in Africa. Right, so Fabrizio, you've got a 1st of September interview. Your South America 31 4X. If your embassy can schedule you earlier, that would be great. There is a situation here where for some of the down under candidates, they only became, like case number 2100, for example. And you may be, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head for South Africa, but in Oceania, there were quite a lot of numbers made current for September, which means that if you have a September interview, you're actually current in that month. And some people have questioned whether it is legal to move your interview into the previous month or not. So if you're an Oceania 2100 and they've moved you into August, can they do that? Is it legal to do that? Can they interview you earlier? And I don't know how they justify it and how they make it work, but I've seen them make it work before in a few cases, a handful of cases, some of which were mistakes. And then there's a couple of cases which seemed very deliberate. But what I can say is that those situations seem to have been honored. In other words, the people that had their interviews scheduled earlier than they should have been issued. And the government just stood by it. It's kind of weird. I don't understand the justification for it, but it has happened. So if you can get your interview accelerated into August, that would be better. It's not like we'll turn into a pumpkin on September 1, but around about early September, I expect there to be sort of kind of a crunch point, right? Depending on what they've done with 221G cases in August, mainly. And so, yeah, beginning of September, it could happen. By the way, another valid question is, have I ever seen interviews cancelled before? And I've only ever seen that one time, as far as I can remember, in 2013 for Iranian candidates. And there was a situation in that year where the Iranians got so close to the cap, they were almost at the cap. I think they were actually, in the end, I think the official numbers show that they got something like 3,820. It was that sort of number, 3,800 or something. It was a very high number, and it got close to the global cap, including the NACARA allowance. And so in that year, there were scheduled interviews with Iranians and the interviews were cancelled just before the interview. So I have known them to cancel interviews, but that was for a 7% country cap, not for a global quota being exhausted. And so, as I say, until DV 2022, that had never been an issue. It only became an issue in 2022. It's quite odd. You're skipping questions. What's the performance of Doha? Yeah, I'm skipping questions because I'm talking about DV 2023. Yeah, so that's right. I'm going to continue to skip your question. Ask your question on a different day. 2023 Kigali, this is the same answer as I've given for other people. If you don't have your 2NL at this point, then you're really very unlikely to get a 2NL now. We're done. Visas are pretty much exhausted. If you don't understand why, go back to the beginning of this video and I explain how close we are to the end, right? Oh, good. Visa are issued there. That's awesome. And you're going to Dallas. Good fun. Enjoy. If any case KCC cancels scheduled interviews for September, it's affect CN ranges or every case. Yeah, we don't know. We don't know. It's going to be, if they start canceling cases, if they apply a cap, if they apply the cap, then it would be kind of a date thing. It would be like, okay, the cap comes down on, let's say, and I'm just picking this date at random. Let's say September the 5th. They know the cap hits. Everything after that point will be cancelled, right? If they decide to apply the cap. Now, I don't know they're going to decide to apply the cap. I'm speculating. And I'm speculating about the 5th of September. So don't freak out about the date. Don't freak out about my speculation about they're going to apply the cap. They might let the cap be exceeded, but I don't know that for a fact either way, right? But if they did apply a cap, and if they did do that, there would be a specific point in time, and they would say, okay, we're not going to allow more issuances after this point. And so then they would just start emailing people to cancel interviews, or they would refer people, embassies would refer people to KCC so that KCC can send out a letter or something. They would do something like that, right? Okay. Before I get more questions, I'm going to call this a day and end the broadcast. But thanks to those of you that asked questions. I'm sorry I didn't answer every one of them, but I really wanted to focus on the DV 2023 questions. This video was very much supposed to be focused on this question of whether visas are exhausted or not for DV 2023. And the reality is, as of today, the visas are not exhausted, but there is obviously going to be some decision point later to see whether we can exceed the cap or not exceed the cap. And then depending on what that decision is, there will be a prioritization between 221G clearances and scheduled interviews. And I really, the bottom line is, I don't know how it's going to go, right? And nobody does. I'm not pretending anybody has inside information. I don't have any inside information, or nobody else knows, right? So there's just no way to know that for sure. Last one there, because it's a happy one. Thanks for all the advice. Moved to Dallas from the UK 2 months ago. Absolutely loving it. My wife has just spent the last 5 weeks in Europe, and it's been bloody hot. We actually even had to switch her travel plans from going to Rome, which was crazy hot, to Lisbon, which is slightly less hot, but still very hot. So yeah, in Dallas, but in Dallas you're also hot. But I mean, Dallas is nice. Dallas is nice, but it is in Texas. And even if you're a UK conservative, yeah, conservatives here are on a different planet. So, it's an entirely different thing. Anyway, good luck with that, Ivan. God bless if you've got a God, and good luck if you don't. All right, everybody. Thanks very much for joining me this evening. Good luck to all of you. I hope things work out for everybody. We'll see how things go. All right. Good night.